Good afternoon and welcome to today's Wednesday webcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Arturo Bris, Professor of Finance and Director of the IMD World Competitiveness Center. We're here for an exclusive webcast previewing the results of the World Competitiveness Yearbook 2017. Arturo, many thanks for being with us today. Always a pleasure to have the annual results coming out. Always some twists and turns, always some surprises. Before we jump into details, just give us a bit of an overview of what you've seen in this year's World Competitiveness Rankings.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for making this possible. As every year, and for the 29th time, the IMD World Competitiveness Center is releasing its annual rankings. This year we're very pleased because we're ranking at the same time both overall competitiveness and also digital competitiveness. But we will talk about that a little bit later. You're asking me about the headlines of this year. Let me remind you first, and it's something that I always do, is that competitiveness is about the long term. And this is because very often we're going confronted with politicians and decision makers that complain or praise their countries about the rankings. They don't realize that it is always about the long term. Our definition of competitiveness is very explicit. It's the ability of a country to generate sustainable value for the economy, be it through productivity, GDP growth, salary increases, prosperity, quality of life, happiness, image of the country abroad. So all of these factors that encompass what we call competitiveness. Having said that, this year we find primarily two big challenges in the world economy. The first one is the challenge of productivity and growth. Is how are we going to cope with the future in which economic growth is going to decline? And in that sense, to me, the biggest result this year when you look at the rankings is that I think rankings are hiding the fact that more and more countries are converging. So with very few exceptions, some countries in Latin America or some countries in Africa, you see that most countries are becoming closer and closer in competitiveness. Hong Kong remains number 1. Venezuela is number 63. This year we have incorporated 2 more countries. But all of these countries are converging. They are all becoming more and more competitive. So these are the two challenges. First one is how to cope with lower economic growth, and second, how do we differentiate, because countries are converging to each other.
So let's talk about the second one, the countries converging. What does that mean? What does that tell us? And how do you see that playing out?
Well, one of the benefits of globalization is that we tend to share practices, systems, processes, people, and then borders become less and less relevant. In that sense, I feel that by us studying countries, I think we're ignoring one of the biggest trends in the world economy these days is that borders are collapsing. It is true that politicians, our policies are probably taking us back in time. And I'm thinking of some political changes taking place in the last couple of years in Europe and the United States. But it is also true that it is a phenomenon that we cannot avoid. And then countries do not differentiate. They tend to do the same things. They look at each other. I think we also contribute with our rankings. So countries, they learn from each other and they learn the practices that improve their competitiveness. And overall, you see that there are marginal differences that explain the rankings.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the second challenge there, so preparing for a period of economic downturn. What does that mean for specific countries, or maybe globally, what are you seeing?
Well, as we see digital transformation in the world and embracement of new technologies, we also see that productivity and growth are stabilizing in very low levels. Mm-hmm. And then this is a big challenge, because technology on the one hand is going to reduce employment, and there are several studies in the last years that have already warned us of employment reductions in the future, but then at the same time we are not growing. In a sense, we will have the same prosperity to be spread out among fewer people, and that poses several challenges for countries. I think some countries are embracing this change by promoting job creation as priority number one. China is a good example. At the detriment of its own competitiveness, the country promotes employment as priority number one. I think other countries are making other type of political choices, be it protectionism or populism.
Okay. You talked there about, you made a reference to digital and digital competitiveness, which is something that you've added into the rankings this year. Can you help us understand what do we actually mean by digital competitiveness and what have those results yielded?
As pioneers in world competitiveness, our center always understood that we need to be on the forefront of understanding the forces that drive prosperity. And certainly, digital transformation and future readiness are becoming paramount in today's world. So that's why the team engaged in the last year on a very, very thorough research exercise to try to assess the digital competitiveness of a country. What we mean by that is that what are the institutional, regulatory, cultural abilities and skills that countries develop so they allow companies to transform digitally. And we have generated, created and published for the first time a digital competitiveness ranking that assesses countries in 3 dimensions. The first dimension is knowledge. So to what extent people are prepared for digital transformation. This requires a lot of public policy behind. Scientific infrastructure, universities, knowledge concentration, investment in education. That's the first factor. The second factor is technology. We need to have communication technologies and Wi-Fi networks and telephony and all the scientific and technological infrastructure that makes transformation possible. And finally, we talk about future readiness, which is much more of a cultural factor. This is to what extent a country and its people are prepared to embrace digital transformation. And this boils down to 2 factors. First of all, adaptive attitudes of people, and second, business agility. So to what extent companies are agile to adapt. Okay? And of course, finally, how those 2 are integrated. So we basically rank countries on these 3 dimensions. As I said, technology, knowledge, and agility or future readiness. And it's interesting because what we saw in our rankings is that there are some countries that are very competitive at the general level, but not very competitive digitally speaking. The 2 best examples are Hong Kong and Switzerland. Even though they rank in the top 4 in global competitiveness, they rank only between 5 and 10 in digital competitiveness.
And why is that, do you think?
Well, in the case of actually both countries, they have both the knowledge and the technological infrastructure, but they lack the business agility and adaptive ability of people to embrace technologies fast enough.
So you mean people are still kind of focused on old world jobs, old world structures?
Yes.
Okay.
Even either because of their education systems or because the culture or because of the success. They tend to be complacent. I give you the counter example. The number 1 country in our rankings in future readiness is Denmark. Okay, this is the country that is best prepared to adopt new business and digital technologies. But if you look at the overall ranking of digital competitiveness, the first 5 countries are usual suspects. Number 1 is Singapore, is the most digitally competitive country in the world, followed by Sweden, the United States, Finland, and Denmark. Finland, interesting as well, because it's a country that ranks in the top 10, 15 countries in overall competitiveness, but it's extremely digitally competitive. And that's the other side of the story.
So a lot of Nordic countries in those top 5 of digital competitiveness. Is this linked with the education system? Often we think of the Nordic countries being very progressive in terms of how they educate children from a very young age. Is that playing into those?
Yes, that's true. Certainly there's a factor at play, their education and values. The fact that those countries have always been on the forefront of technological innovation. But I think also it has to do with the technological and digital infrastructure. Not only the intangible one, but also the physical one. These countries are better prepared to embrace digital change because they have the systems that this requires and the investment that it requires.
So in a world that's changing, where we're going to be losing jobs, where jobs will be disappearing, they'll be replaced by robots or automation, it sounds like this digital competitiveness ranking is going to become increasingly important.
Exactly. I think that in the future, digital competitiveness will drive overall competitiveness because, as we say at IMD, digital transformation is not an option, it's a necessity. And I think to the extent that countries can facilitate that process, they will be more competitive in the long run. That is, they will create more prosperity for people.
Okay, so moving forward, we might expect more convergence between the digital competitiveness ranking and the global competitiveness ranking.
Hopefully. You see, there's a lot of complacency as well today. So I think that either because of success or failures, some countries, they ignore digital transformation as a fad, and I think that's a big mistake.
Okay. Well, look, let's jump into the global competitiveness rankings. Give us the top spots. Who are at the top of the podium, and any surprises there?
As usual, it is difficult to find a common recipe for competitiveness because if you look at the top 5 countries in our ranking this year, they are Hong Kong #1, then Switzerland, Singapore, the United States, and the Netherlands. These are all type of countries. They are small and big, exporting and importing, Western and Eastern, democracies and not, and it's different model for each of these countries. Although, the pillars of competitiveness for these 5 countries remain always the same. Very strong infrastructure, both physical and intangible, that is health and education, and excellent regulation, that is business-friendly, business-promoting regulation. The other differences, are less important. But to me, having the institutional and infrastructure factors behind is paramount.
Okay. So in comparison with last year, a little bit of changes with the top 5 this year and the top 5 last year.
Correct. The US is the biggest change in the top 5. It pleases me a lot the fact that our ranking is always up to date. Because we based our rankings in a survey that accounts for 1/3 of our metrics, and this survey is conducted between January and April of this year. Basically means that all of the political events of the last year, and in particular the US election, have been picked by our survey. That is very visible in the result for the United States. That drops to 1 position in the ranking depending on the factors, primarily because of the observation by executives that there is more uncertainty on exchange rate policy, transparency of the government, protectionism, openness of the country, and institutional factors like, for example, fiscal policy. And all of this uncertainty that surrounds the election of a new president has been very detrimental to the competitiveness of the United States. The other countries then remain somehow similar. And you don't see big changes in Singapore or in Hong Kong. They are just marginal, and the ranking just readjusts to the United States position.
Would you expect, we're at the beginning of a new presidency in the US, with potentially another 3 years to go, would you expect the rankings to continue to slide for the US?
Well, it's difficult to say, first of all, because we don't know to what extent the new presidency's policies are going to be successful, nor we know which these policies are going to be. So by the book, if you look at Donald Trump's recipe for economic policy, is certainly successful in the very short term because it pushes some macroeconomic metrics like exchange rate and so on, but it's not sustainable in the long term. So it is going to be, if successful, detrimental to the competitiveness of the United States. First and foremost, because for us, closing a country to trade, it's always reducing competitiveness. Okay, that's a very simple equation. So if and only if the new presidency's policies were to be implemented and successful, we will probably see increases in the very short term, but reduction in competitiveness in the long term.
Okay. If we look at the countries that have climbed up and down, the biggest climbers from last year to this year have been China, up 7 places, and the United Arab Emirates also up 5 places. What explains such a large jump for each of those countries?
Started by the end, the United Arab Emirates implemented a massive government reform at the beginning of 2015, which included very drastic changes in, for example, objectives of economic policy. Remember, it was the government appointed a new minister for happiness, just to measure economic success in a different terms, but also changing economic policy in always the right direction. The UAE has been always in permanent transformation, and then we see the success of those policies already in 2017. In particular, with respect to perceptions about the future success of those policies. So the UAE has gone up. In the case of China, it's a significant improvement in labor markets. Again, if you look at the overall world economy, productivity has remained flat in most of the countries, except for China and India. And in those countries, you see employment increases, better figures in terms of job creation, and higher productivity, and hence relatively higher salaries. So the labor market in China has improved so much that it climbs in productivity. Now, the warning is that, on the contrary, still China remains, as the rankings show, number 18 in overall competitiveness. And this is because China still lacks the institutional framework, business regulation, cultural and management practices that will help the country becoming more competitive. It's still an over-regulated country. It is still a country where competition is not at play, and those are the barriers that prevent China from becoming more competitive, even though, for example, it's the most successful economy in macroeconomic terms in 2016.
Okay, so some specific obstacles then for China to overcome in order to really unleash its competitiveness.
Yes, to make their industries and their services sectors more competitive.
We see some countries that unfortunately seem to always be languishing towards the end of the tail, bottom of the list this year Venezuela. What can we learn from this? It always seems to be a country that has difficulty in taking off from a competitiveness point of view.
It obviously is not surprising to anybody that countries like Venezuela, but also Brazil, are at the bottom of our rankings. These are definitely wrong choices of economic models. Lack of true economic policy, a wrong approach towards competitiveness, a complete absence of the private sector, and finally, as in the case of Brazil, dismissing completely the role of infrastructure in the development of a country. That is roads, ports, airports, but also health systems, public education systems. When you ignore those, then it takes you 1-2 generations to become more competitive.
Okay. Let's look at 2 other countries to finish off, countries that have been in the news for different reasons. Greece, which we haven't been hearing a lot about recently, where are they now in the competitiveness rankings? And I'd also like to talk about the UK, but let's start with Greece. What's going on there?
In Greece, we have been in survival mode for the last 5-6 years. So Greece still ranks in the bottom 10 of our ranking. It's obviously doing what it must be done, which is following the recipes of the European Union. The actual transformation of the country to make it more competitive is not happening yet, because I think they still need to recover the moribund sick country. So we will see improvements hopefully in the next years, but not yet. Okay. With respect to the UK, it's interesting how Brexit has improved the macro magnitudes of the United Kingdom in our rankings, except that the business sentiment has deteriorated because there's a lot of uncertainty. And that's what our rankings are picking up this year. So there is more uncertainty regarding, obviously, exchange rate policy, the role of the central bank, the resilience of the economy, social cohesion, and all the factors that Brexit is going to bring about, which are, at the end of the day, long-term factors of competitiveness. In the short term, though, the UK has improved its position through its economic performance. Finally, I think the UK is never in, or it has not been in the top 10 in the last years because of its public sector. I mean, as France or as Italy, these are European countries with very big public sectors in which private initiative, in a sense, is coerced to really create jobs and take advantage of new opportunities. And I think for the long run, of course, in European countries, reducing the influence of the public sector is going to be key.
So in the United Kingdom, it sounds like you're saying short term, not so bad. In fact, it's interesting, pre-Brexit vote, lots of people were painting very stark pictures of the economy is going to, tank the next day. In reality, the short term, it's almost been something good for the UK, but you're already picking up signs that say, hey, over the long term, this might not be such a good deal.
Exactly. I mean, there are many uncertainties. As I said, for example, what happens to the financial sector, what is going to be the deal cut with the European Union. And in that sense, you see that our executive survey picks all of this uncertainty, which is never good. We see also a big deterioration of the image of the country abroad. So all of these factors, I think, play a negative effect in the long run.
Yeah, okay. Maybe one final country that just comes to mind, and this is very fresh or may not have been picked up in the survey, is France. So we've just seen new presidential elections in France. Any thoughts that you would like to bring to the table concerning France?
These have been very recent events, so of course not picked up in our rankings. But as we have observed in the past, new presidents that come with a business-oriented attitudes, like Emmanuel Macron in France, I think they always bring about increases in competitiveness. The best example is Italy. Italy 4 years ago, went through a very similar political change with Matteo Renzi, and just a change in sentiment in the private sector in Italy marked the biggest improvement in competitiveness in 2015 for any country that year, and that was for Italy. I foresee that for next year, I think the same positive sentiment, if things continue as they are now, the same positive sentiment is going to affect France positively.
Arturo, thanks so much for being with us today. I know this is a super busy period for you. You've interviews with pretty much every newspaper and news outlet on the planet over the next couple of days. So thanks so much for being with us. Thank you for sharing the results. And we look forward to further discussions together on all the great work and research that you're doing in the World Competitiveness Centre. Thank you very much.
Thank you.